presentation is looking at something that I'm working with and involved with here locally in New Mexico. So the title is Foundational Understandings of Literacy, Honoring Indigenous Families, Communities, Nations, and Environments. I'm uh, honored to be here today. Of course, I'd like to acknowledge not just my presence, but other people's presence. So Yonkias Joshua Frank Cardenas. I'm an assistant professor of education at UNM Valencia. We're a branch campus of the University of New Mexico system. I am a coordinator of early childhood and K-12 programs there. I've taught pre-K to PhD level students. Currently, I'm teaching mostly future teachers. But I'd also like to acknowledge, those folks who are in California and the peoples here where I'm living, um, and to give recognition and voice to uh, all the peoples represented. So um, my people originally from Ganyenge and Oswegan. However, I was born and raised in Hutukna, or what is called Anaheim, Tongva territory. And I grew up in Payamkawicham or Luiseño territory in the city of Lake Elsinore or Payachinabetuna, place where the waters gather. So I want to recognize those places that help raise me. And then also where the conference is being held in Tongva territory. And I currently live and work in Tiwa territory, lands claimed and occupied since time immemorial by the people of Isleta Pueblo, which they call Tsukuevaga. And so to begin and to further elaborate on kind of the context, um, which is the problem, right? The issue at stake, which is that indigenous languages like peoples and their homelands have been made expendable in the face of colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, development, and progress, profit, and power. My peoples originally from Ganyenge are Haga or Mohawk and Onondaga or Seneca, which are members of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, who have had relations and relationships with various imperial and colonial and neo-colonial or confederated state powers, nation states as we call them today, um, since just after um, uh, the Dutch and English and French set foot on East Coast waters. Um, and so for our languages to survive is incredible in the face of colonial, religious, and other state policies. A UN report from not even too long ago, I believe it's 2018, found that an indigenous language dies every 2 weeks. And this rate is only accelerating. So only a few indigenous or non-Western languages of the Americas are considered safe, such as Guarani of Paraguay, which is a language of the state nation. Otherwise, there are no real safe languages or not in jeopardy. A language is considered endangered if within the next 50 to 100 years it is predicted there will be no more speakers at the current rate. And this is according to UNESCO and some other folks. All the Pueblo, as they're called, languages of New Mexico have received an endangered status alongside Dene Basat or Navajo and Inde Basat or Apache. And while Navajo, for example, has many technical speakers as one of the largest native surviving nations in the United States, the children today are by far and large not speaking it as their first language, let alone second or third language. A replacement effect has occurred whereby English is becoming dominant and replacing it as the first language. So this coincides with the final stages of imperialism and colonialism, which is that of total assimilation, culturally, economically, and in all aspects of a people's life and relationships, especially linguistically. And so, to give you a kind of brief introduction to Native nations of New Mexico, New Mexico is a colonial construction of the Spanish Empire, and this land and landscape and environments were all claimed, owned, occupied, and named by the various indigenous peoples, and it was not a cohesive whole or place. So this construct begins with the Spanish Empire and is rooted in the invasion and colonization of Mexico as it proceeded, beginning with the 1519 invasion by Hernan Cortez, who went rogue. Um, so the framework and relationship of New Mexico to Native nations is rooted in this prior imperialism and colonialism, which was at first extremely violent and deadly. The image above that is shared is of the conquistador self-styled Juan de Oñate, and it expresses this very clearly, right? He has blood on his hands, blood on his face, blood on his body. When he came with his retinue to New Mexico territory or this area, he came to Acoma Pueblo, for example, in 1598. He demanded gold, took slaves, and left and wanted to leave his friars behind for conversion purposes. The Pueblo and its people in turn rebelled, and in 1599 he put down this rebellion, specifically by putting 507 Acoma men on trial. Um, Women between the ages of 12 and 25 were subjected to servitude or enslavement for 20 years at the Pueblo of Okeowenge, and then men over the age of 25 had one foot cut off, and younger men were enslaved for 20 years. And this is their original experience with imperial and colonial powers. Today, there are 23 federally recognized tribal nations of New Mexico, including the 19 confederated pueblos of Tihuehuetoa and Keres speakers, the Ashiwi or Zuni Pueblo, the Navajo Nation or Dene Nation, and two Apache or Inde peoples at Mescalero and Fort Sill. And this is within the 574 federally recognized tribes today. The Pueblos, for example, have creation stories that speak of a center place, that of Sipapu, which is their place of emergence. They do not have a migration story or immigration story. They are considering themselves to be peoples of their original homelands. And we know that all peoples come from different places, but their identity is fully, um, to their knowledge, constructed in those places. So they are peoples of those places. New Mexico's native nations were independent, fierce, freedom-loving farmers, hunters, city builders, and scientists. So they didn't need to be civilized. They were also highly adept orators and literati of their own right. So New Mexico was claimed by the Spanish, was occupied briefly until the First American Revolution, as they call it there, or as we call it here, which is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which they kicked the Spanish out and of the region. It was later and soon reoccupied from 1701 to 1823, and there was a peace planned and land grants were given and recognized, but it was basically a divide and conquer approach. Some accepted, some did not. The Republic of Mexico, right, claimed their lands after 1823 in their revolution, and then after the fall of the Spanish Empire until 1846, when the United States invaded the Republic of Mexico and forced the sale at gunpoint of New Mexico, including its native nations, Chicanos, Genizaros, Nuevo Mexicanos citizens, as they were citizens of Mexico, which had outlawed slavery already at that point, unlike the United States, and were forced to become part of the United States, with New Mexico remaining in a territorial status from 1848 to 1912, when it became the 47th state. And this is in part because of its great diversity of cultures and languages. White people did not want this kind of diversity entering into the state because they did not, or into the Confederation, because they did not know how it would affect things. Currently, there are a little bit more than 242,000 Native peoples who represent 11% of the population of New Mexico. and are related to specific tribal communities. And this is the fourth largest of all US states. So taking a look here at our maps and our language trees, we can find the native languages of New Mexico represented. There are 7 native languages spoken out of 23 dialects, you could say. And these have been studied and consolidated by linguists into 3 language families, the Kiowa-Tanoan, the Na-Dene, and the Zuni, or Ashiwi. Kiowa-Tanoan includes Keresan, which is spoken at Laguna, Acoma, Cochiti, Tsia, Santana, Kewa, and San Felipe. Tewa is spoken at Okeawinge, Santa Clara, San Ildefonso, Nambe, Tesuque, and Pojoaque. And Tiwa is spoken at Isleta, Sandia, Picuris, and Taos, while Toa, which is only spoken at Hemesh. Zuni Pueblo speaks its own language, Ashiwi, and is an isolate, which is, as far as we can tell, unrelated to any other known language. These have all been kind of formulated into some colonial conception of pueblos or peoples who live in cities. Our oldest villages and cities here being Acoma and Taos are more than 900 years old and are the oldest surviving towns, you could say, in all of the United States today. Speakers of Na-Dene related languages include Dene Basad, which is spoken by the Navajo Nation, and Inde Basa, which is spoken by the Apache members at Mescalero and Fort Sill. All of these, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to keep going. All of these languages have a name for the people in these languages, and so Tewa, Tiwa, Towa, Dene, and Inde are all actual names of the people who speak the language. And so without these languages, they cannot even identify themselves as the people. What we have in terms of linguistic imperialism, etc., colonialism, is that all of these languages are now moribund or becoming obsolescent. And this is because of the experiences I described already. Various treaties with the Dene or Navajo and the Inde or Apache remark, and these are in 1867 and 1868, are the first remarks of requiring schooling or civilizing of native peoples, which is arguably unnecessary. The product of this led to, for example, the establishment, and in 1879 more schools, of at least 43 schools in New Mexico specifically for Native people. And this is before it became a state, right? So before there were any compulsory education laws, they were compulsed by federal treaties. And so within reservation communities and in off-reservation boarding schools, we know that there are at least 17 of these sites have children interned at them, so they never came home. So these aren't just safe places to get an education, these are places where you may never come home. And multiple generations went to these schools beginning in 1867 and 68, all the way through the 1960s until they started to become contracted and run by Native communities via the Tribal and Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975. Surveys from the 90s and on have reported that 17.7% of Navajo pre-K children were monolingual speakers, while 27.9% were bilingual compared to 54.3% who were monolingual English speakers. So this has only accelerated in basically all communities, and there aren't any really first language speakers of most of these languages, except for in some of the Pueblo communities and sporadic, Inde and Dene families. Otherwise, it's very widespread that many students are monolingual English speakers and learning their languages as second or third languages. And so the real problem that we're running into here is that while we're establishing and students are going to various schooling, whether it's on the reservation or off the reservation, many of our early childhood sites and our Head Starts and pre-Ks are predominantly monolingual English-speaking sites. Our K-12 schools are predominantly monolingual speaking sites. And Dr. Vincent Rito at the University of New Mexico, a Diné scholar, has argued that unless indigenous languages are acknowledged as being equal to other languages in all aspects of communities' livelihood, recognized as still being functional and purposeful in today's context and used and validated in academic contexts as well, they will continue to be marginalized and devalued, which they basically are. So part of this issue, right, is that there are differing concepts of orality and literacy, and of course of education and schooling. By orality, we mean the ability to hear and speak a language. By literacy, we mean the ability to read and write a language. And so predominantly, all of these languages, their focus and their value system focuses on orality. And so you can see from Regis Pecos, former governor of Cochiti, who says the sacred gift of language is the most precious gift that one can pass on to others to sustain a way of life gifted to us by our Creator, or by Chavaria, who says that our Tewa language is the glue that holds our culture, traditions, and religion together. Without our Tewa language, how do we continue to carry on our lifestyle? So there's a completely different concept of what is orality and its value, and literacy and what is its value. And none of these languages were written prior to colonialism. And really only Diné or Navajo and Inde or Apache have writing systems that are in widespread use. Some of the Pueblos have writing systems, and all of these were developed predominantly by religious figures in their communities. So um, these were not like community-wide traditions of writing that were developed, nor were they developed by like native scholars in their communities. So there's not a really big push or pull in these communities to focus on literacy. And the focus, especially now because they're in such an obsolescent or moribund stage, is it needs to be focused on orality. Yet all of the school sites and sites that are created and run by non-native community members um, are focused on literacy, which the communities predominantly feel is the opposite way they should go. And so what have Native people done? Well, they have studied their language and they have focused on them and they have come up with, their own ways of thinking and doing in response to colonialism and linguistic imperialism. And basically, people have concluded, like Eunice Romero Little, that it's crucial that our children learn our native languages and learn them well. It is so connected with why we socialize them and how we socialize them through and with our native languages and how we interact with our children, end quote. And basically, what Native peoples have come up with over time is they've come up with language nests and immersion programs, which focus predominantly on speaking and learning only their language. And that is because they have found that even Native students who are in these programs still learn English from their first or second language speaking parents and from the larger communities, from media, from schooling, etc. So there is basically no doubt that they will learn English, um, and they feel very strongly that language nests and immersion programs, especially developed for and by their communities, are the answer. Yet these have by and large not been funded. These have by and large been challenged, and they are in 99 plus percentage in non-native run and dominated schools, whether in urban or native reservation environments. Um, some of the tools and techniques and ways that are in these immersion programs are either one-way immersion programs completely done in their language up to a certain level. Then they may become two-way programs, or they might be founded as two-way programs. We have full immersion programs, which they're taught completely in their language. And then they gradually develop some kind of partial immersion program from like usually third or fourth grade on. But now with state testing and federal testing and standardized testing at third grade, predominantly it's to third grade. Or there's partial immersion programs. Native peoples have found in their own studies of their programs that only full immersion programs have been successful at reproducing native speakers, especially as first language speakers, and especially who will go on to continue to speak their language throughout their lives. And this is predominantly what Native people have fought for and have challenged the communities around them for. While many, like the state of New Mexico, for example, most of its approaches, whether it's pre-K or K-12, focuses on driving you and pushing you into literacy. Native peoples have found that that approach actually defocuses and de-emphasizes their oral language. So the big question, right, has become, can schools maintain native languages? And I'll finish here. And what we found is that only schools shown to maintain and develop and revitalize native languages are native-run immersion schools, whether they're language nests, which are from 0 to 5, or K-12 schools. In New Mexico, we do not have any immersion K-12 schools. Partially of this has been lack of funding and lack of support by non-native people. It hasn't been without effort by native people. Currently, we have 3 native language nests at Karis Children's Learning Center, Walatoa Head Start, and Sadkitle in Albuquerque, but that's it. We recently had a bill at the Senate, at the state level, that was supported bipartisan, but the governor shot it down with a pocket veto, and this would have established tribal compact schools to basically establish immersion schools. So we've, run into a ton of problems there. In 2018, we had a case, the Yazi Martinez case, which said that the state had been miseducating Native people amongst other peoples since its time as a state, and basically has failed the population. We also have the New Mexico Indian Education Act, um, which says that we need to ensure the maintenance of native languages, and so it has failed on all of these levels. And then in a recent case lawsuit that was brought forth by the state, or brought against the state, they have said, oh yeah, since the 2018 verdict, nothing has changed, and it's actually been in further and sliding decline on all levels academically, let alone native language proficiency. The most recent efforts that we have are a National Fund for Excellent in American Indian Education Award, which has a number of schools that are set and poised to become immersion schools, but these have yet to take place, and it's hard to tell within the Trump administration if that funding will be reneged or pulled away. And so relevant to this conference and relevant to folks that are listening, what we have found, right, is where technologies fail, communities succeed. As Greg Cajete talks about, civilizations are not the enduring human systems, it's in fact communities are. And this is what we have found in native New Mexico, is that dictionaries, quote, are not the same as speech, and books and recordings can preserve languages, but only people and communities can keep them alive. And the focus, end quote, and that is from Lord. The focus here in New Mexico needs to be upon orality rather than on literacy. Most pueblos are hesitant and reticent to let their languages be documented and preserved in such a fashion, and need and want to focus on orality. So we need native immersion schools and language nests that focus on teaching and learning the language in an oral fashion, as they have traditionally since time immemorial. And so to conclude, right, for generations, from the words of President Mark McCorro of the National Congress of American Indians, the United States government's policies erased indigenous languages through assimilationist policies. Our recent ancestors were punished for speaking their indigenous languages, the first languages spoken in America. As their descendants, it's our obligation to rebuild and revitalize what was taken from us. With our languages, we teach our children, conduct our ceremonies, interpret the world around us, and govern our tribal nations. So, right, this question of how and which direction to go is that many communities have experienced and utilized various like techniques and technologies, focuses on literacy, etc. And all of these has basically failed to revitalize native languages. And so native communities just feel really strongly and passionately that the only way to revitalize them is for all total control to be into their hands. Yet we've seen at the state level they have resisted that. In fact, pocket vetoed it. And only at the federal level have Native nations been able to receive some funding and some support, whether it's through that recent Fund for Excellence Act or funding, or the Native American Languages Act, and other sources like that. But all of it has been very short term, and even the National Fund for Excellence is short term as well. So it's very unclear if this is the kind of thing that will last. And it's also unclear if Native people can hold out much longer, right, without any kind of widespread support. And so Native people do recognize that they do need support from non-Native communities and individuals to help fund their Native languages, to support the transformation of public schools, which is where the dominant population of Native people do go to schools and public schools, which are predominantly monolingual institutions, that have supported this legacy of past oppression into the predominant and dominant hegemonic order of today. So I want to thank you all for listening to what I had to share, from these work and communities that I serve here in New Mexico and elsewhere. So Nyaunga, and thank you.